The First World War saw a huge increase in the use of artillery. Once the mobile war drew to a halt and forces dug in, the trench war began, and immediately artillery seemed to come to the fore in dealing with this tactic. Most generals believed that an immense projection of force focused on a single point could push the lines back. The combination of artillery, mortar, and the new forward observation capability of aircraft was to punch holes in the front lines, allowing the new tank and infantry to penetrate the breach. This required a lot of artillery. The Somme offensive by Allied forces along a 19-kilometre front from July to November 1916 is recorded as one of the bloodiest military operations ever undertaken and the largest battle of World War I. The attempt to break through German lines and draw forces away from the Battle of Verdun resulted in 1.5 million casualties, mainly from artillery and machine gun. The true horror of modern warfare had been revealed. The Battle of Vimy Ridge was a success for artillery. A Canadian forces diversionary offensive against the German 6th Army along the Western Front, lasting 4 days, it utilized the creeping barrage and tactical innovation. The Canadians were able to rout the German forces. On the other hand, artillery usage could prove a failure. At the Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, Commonwealth forces attacked German lines in an attempt to reach the coast and German U-boat bases. The majority of the battlefield was swampy, reclaimed marshland, and after artillery bombardment became an impassable sea of sticky mud, which bogged down tanks, and countless soldiers drowned. After 3 months of fighting, Passchendaele was taken, and the battle ended on the 6th of November 1917. Allied forces lost 500,000 casualties, the Germans half that at 250,000. The ground captured from the offensive equated to 2 inches of ground for each soldier's life.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
April 22nd, 1915. German forces secretly moved thousands of chlorine gas cylinders into position around Ypres. 168 tons, enough to swamp Allied trenches along a 4-mile front. The French troops stationed there have no idea what's coming.
The Germans were prepared at Ypres to use gas for some time, but they actually had to wait until the weather conditions were just right. That typically the wind was blowing from west to east, which meant that any gas attack coming from the German side would have blown right back into their own soldiers. And then one evening, the wind changed direction.
The Germans begin the Second Battle of Ypres by opening the valves on nearly 6,000 chlorine gas cylinders. The gas is piped into no man's land, where a light breeze picks it up. In just 5 minutes, a deadly cloud, 4 miles wide, is drifting towards the French line. Willy Siebert is a gas specialist with the unit deploying the world's first WMD in battle.
As this great cloud of green-gray gas was forming in front of us, we suddenly heard the French yelling.
A French medical officer is among the first victims.
I had the impression that I was looking through green glasses. At the same time, the gas burnt my throat, caused pains in my chest, and made breathing all but impossible.
Tanks. Invented by the British in World War I, they were a source of fascination for the soldiers who fought alongside them. The public were just as mesmerised. These were among the first images people had ever seen of these lumbering metal monsters. And when the Battle of Ancre film was released in early 1917, millions of Britons rushed to see it. And who can blame them? Tanks were like nothing else seen before. But, looking back now at those early years of the tank, it's astonishing how rapidly it evolved. On the 30th of June 1915, right here on Wormwood Scrubs in West London, Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George first saw this. An armoured vehicle that could cut through barbed wire. Just 3 months later, it had become this.
This is Little Willie. It's the oldest tank in the world. This one wasn't thought to be long enough to get across the German trenches, and so subsequent models were stretched out.
Little Willie was replaced by Big Willie, also known as Mother. This was the first tank to hit the battlefield, the Mark I. Its first engagement wasn't a resounding success, but it showed its potential. Independently, the French had come up with their very own tank designs. unreliable and frequently got stuck. The real game changer was this: the Mark IV.
Into the Mark IV tank. I mean, this was the real workhorse of the middle years of the First World War. It bristling with armament. You got the 6-pound gun here. You got this would have been a Lewis gun or a light machine gun here, and then you enter the main body of the tank. Quite tight for space. There would have been 8 people in here, 8 crew required. 4 of them just required to drive the thing. Right in the middle, dominating the whole space, is the engine. And there we go. It's an old pre-war tractor engine. As you can see, there's no partition here between the engine compartment and the crew compartment, and that meant that people had huge problems. The crews often had to be hospitalised after a day or two in the tank. They'd become asphyxiated by the fumes coming off this engine. Also incredibly hot. These exhaust pipes here would have been glowing red hot, and with all the bodies in here as well, it would have been absolutely baking.
Even so, they were held in affection and often named by their crews.
Clamber up here to the commander's seat. First thing I guess about this is that they would have these windows to see through, but of course if they were taking incoming fire, they had to close these, and they had to look through little periscopes, glass periscopes here. More slots, machine gun here, more holes in it to shoot you, put your pistol through and shoot people off the outside of the tank. It was a very, very heavily armoured vehicle, but also one capable of really taking the fight to the enemy as well. They made 1,000 of these during World War I, and it went on to serve with great success in battles like Cambrai.
The tank was becoming an integral part of the Allied strategy.
As armoured warfare evolved, the number of different types of tank multiplied. This was a so-called whippet tank. It was designed to follow the heavy tanks into battle. Then when they'd made the penetration, these could spread out, speeding behind the German lines, sowing absolute chaos.
The French had a similar idea, and only a few months earlier, in 1917, had launched the popular Renault FT-17. This was a light tank, and the first with a fully rotating turret. But it wasn't as quick as the Whippet.
This could do 8 miles an hour, a dizzying speed, around double what other tanks could do at the time. The Germans were slow to pick up on the whole tank thing. Initially, their high command thought it was pretty unmanly driving around the battlefield in a steel container. Good old walking was good enough. Quite rapidly, though, they realised their mistake, and they produced this, the Sturm Panzerwagen. The Germans were slow to produce them, though, partly because of the lack of that top-down drive and also the lack of materials thanks to Britain's blockade of Germany. Very few were built, and they didn't really go into service until the last days of the war.
In fact, the Germans probably used more captured British tanks than their own home-produced models. The Germans even set up special workshops where they brought and repaired captured tanks. Meanwhile, the British design just kept evolving.
After the Mark IV tank came, surprise, surprise, the Mark V. Now this was the vehicle that played its part in the titanic British victories of the summer and autumn of 1918. It spearheaded British attacks like the one at the Battle of Amiens on August the 8th, which saw British and Allied infantry advance further into German lines than any other battle on the Western Front in World War I. These Mark V's were faster, more reliable than the Mark IVs. They were also able to be steered by one person, unlike the 4 people required to steer this tank's predecessor. Britain's massive industrial base and innovative culture was producing tanks which every year were becoming better and better by orders of magnitude. In less than 3 years, tanks had gone from the drawing board to becoming integral to Allied war plans. They were no longer just a novelty, but another part of the machinery of war, one that was critical to the final Allied victory. Throughout history, victory's been decided by what's going on down here on the surface of the Earth. Britain, for example, in the 19th century came to dominate the globe by controlling the world's oceans. But from the First World War onwards, warfare took to the skies, and now controlling the air is a key part of military strategy. And all that began with those brave pioneer aviators of the First World War. In 1909, Louis Blériot set off on a flight that would make history. His aim was to win a prize of £1,000 for the first plane to cross the English Channel. It wasn't the most elegant of flights and ended in a rather rough landing. But he'd made it. The plane he flew was a Blériot 11, like this one here. It's amazing it got that far, it looks so flimsy. Even more remarkably, this one still flies. Not exactly Top Gun. When the war started 5 years later, planes like this were still in production, and a few visionaries thought these might have a military application. With that, the first major air war had begun. At first, planes like this were reconnaissance vehicles. They were having a look at what was going on behind enemy lines and reporting back. But gradually they started actually taking an active role on the battlefield. Pilots were issued with these nasty looking things, flechettes, spikes that if you drop out the side might hit enemy troops, or even bombs. Planes were now an important weapon of war. You gotta be kidding. There's no way I'd go up in this thing. This might have been the future, but it's pretty primitive. In fact, I feel like I'm sitting in a wicker garden chair surrounded by a sea of canvas. To steer it, you just move this column, and it's connected by a very flimsy looking set of wires to the wings themselves, not little flappy bits like modern aircraft. The whole wings move, they twist. It's a system called wing warping. The engine is underpowered and prone to overheating. It can only fly at 47 miles per hour. It can only go at about 3,000 feet, no more. And as for the instrument panel, you get one dial, your oil pressure. That's it. Whew. But as planes went into service in World War I, the pressure was on to improve the technology. Soon there was an arms race that pushed aircraft development at an astonishing rate. The pace of innovation in those years was like nothing seen before or since. Just a few years into the war, they had planes like that. Is that cool? What makes this aircraft so distinctive are the 3 sets of wings. Now they're designed to give that aircraft the necessary lift, but make the wings narrower so the pilot can see more of what's going on the ground. It also made the plane very, very manoeuvrable. There's an old story that the first ever test pilot amazed onlookers by doing 3 consecutive loop-the-loops. plane can fly 117 miles an hour. That's 2.5 times as fast as the Blériot, and it can fly 7 times higher. Such was the pace of innovation that some planes that were cutting edge could be obsolete just a few months later. But innovation wasn't just changing how these planes flew, it was changing how they fought. It's said that at the very start of the war, when enemy planes passed each other, they'd give a friendly wave. That didn't last, and the age of air-to-air combat was born. At first, it was just the pilots taking pot shots with a pistol. But the next generation of aircraft would have guns as part of their design. It soon became clear the most effective way for the weapon to point was in the direction that the aircraft is travelling. Big problem there, though, of course, is you end up shooting your own propeller off, which is a bit of a disaster. The first solution they tried was to mount a machine gun on top of the wing, on top of the propeller. The trouble with that was that the pilot basically had to sort of stand up in his seat, release his strap, stand up here, and replace the magazine when it ran out of bullets. Completely unworkable, really. This SE5 had a system whereby the gun could slide back down to be reloaded and then slide up into its firing position. Still very cumbersome, though. The Germans soon came up with an even better solution, and it was quickly copied by the Brits. To show you how it works, I'm going to need to slow this down. They connected the machine gun to the crankshaft of the propeller with a series of cam plates, and that meant the machine gun only fired when these propeller's blades weren't in the way. It was a very precise bit of engineering. Get it wrong, you blow your own propeller off. The amazing thing about the First World War is that by the end of it, pretty much every significant part of aerial warfare was already in development. Planes were being used for reconnaissance, for communications, for dropping supplies, for dropping bombs, and for air-to-air combat.
Germany announces an exclusion zone of unrestricted submarine warfare, a campaign to attack all enemy ships, military and civilian, without warning. Its goal, to cut off all British commerce and vital war supplies.
A lot of the things that Britain needs to survive, it has to bring in. And it brings it in by ships, largely from the United States, from South America, along well-traveled and long-established shipping lanes. Britain doesn't get what it needs from those ships. The British are going to starve. And so the Germans could cut them off from the outside world with submarines. They could force the British to leave the war.
Until now, U-boats tried to play by international rules of engagement for all naval vessels and give civilian crews the chance to surrender and abandon ship before sinking it.
Well, you can see the obvious problems with that. When a submarine surfaced, it's vulnerable, and the British very quickly learned to arm their merchant ships. Submarines would surface, and the merchant ship would start shooting at them.
It couldn't stop a ship, take the passengers off, put them in a place of safety on board the submarine. There just wasn't space. You might capture the captain, but there wasn't space for all the crew and passengers. So submarines had to be used in a very inhumane way.
The new rules of engagement get fast results. By the end of April 1915, German U-boats sink 39 merchant ships, using both torpedoes and their powerful deck guns. But the new tactic of shoot on sight means American ships and citizens are soon caught in the crossfire.
The problem with unrestricted submarine warfare for the Germans was that you couldn't tell necessarily who you were sinking.